Welcome back, seedlings. Happy spring. It's officially spring. Are you excited?
I am very excited. It is warm today. It is beautiful today. You look like you're ready for
I
spring.
am. I've checked out of winter. I'm like, nope, we're done.
We're, we're done.
Boots, done. Don't care if it snows tomorrow. Still wearing like heels or sandals or something.
I think that's the attitude to have. I think that,
Like, it's over.
yep, I'm done with this, period.
Yes.
Well
All
done.
right.
Well done.
Seedlings. So we have to talk about something important, which from the outside, I don't think it really looks like a basic seed, simple concept, but I think it really is. So I think we need to talk about it. So we've been going through this whole Leviticus 26 thing for the last like couple weeks
Yep.
that we've been reading where in the first part of it, God is, he's talking to the Israelites like as they're going through the desert and leaving like Egypt and all these things. And he's talking about his promises, and he's talking to them first about the blessings that they'll have
Yep.
if they're obedient. And then he's talking about all the curses they'll have if they're disobedient. And as you read through them, they get worse and worse and worse the more disobedient they are.
Yep.
But the part that I actually want to read to you guys is just like at the end where God then talks about what happens after that. So I'm going to read them real quick and then we can talk about them.
Good. Let's go.
All right. So in Leviticus 26, verse 40, after all the curses, God says, if they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers, which they trespass which they trespass against me, and that also they have walked contrary unto me, and that I have also walked contrary unto them, and have brought them into the land of their enemies, if then their uncircumcised hearts be humbled, and they then accept of the punishment of their iniquity, then will I remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham will I remember, and I will remember the land. So the huge part that stuck out to me, which is why I want to like look, is it sounds like, okay, like I don't get it, like what, it's confusing. But God is saying, you can go through all of these bad things, be disobedient, be cursed, and all these things, but if you turn back to me, if you repent, if you accept your iniquities and all these things, then I will remember my covenant with you. And that just kind of struck me as like, we're always claiming all these promises, right? And we're saying like, God, you have your Abraham covenant and you said you do all these things. Like, why are we being punished, right? Because we're your people. Why are we going through all these curses and all these things? So he says like, you're going to be disciplined, but if you hold up your side of this bargain, then I'll remember mine. But until then, he basically says, I don't have to.
Yeah, I think, it's a covenant is such a different thing in nature than a single promise.
Right.
And so in the Bible, a covenant is really kind of a whole thing of promises that God says, I'm going to do, I'm going to keep, but here's what you also have to do, a bunch of promises that you have to do. Where, we normally think of a promise as a single thing, right? I promise to clean my room, Mom. I promise to do this. Right. A covenant is really that whole idea of the mother-child, father-child, whole relationship put together. And so I love it because what God says is, listen, I made a covenant with Abraham, I made it with Isaac, I made it with Jacob, I made it with, and he goes through and says, listen, I'm going to continue that with the family, right? The whole idea of the Israelites and the Jewish people in nature. I'm going to keep my end of the bargain if you keep your end of the bargain. And the cool thing about it is that if you don't keep your end of the bargain, and all of a sudden all the things that I said I was going to do happen, right? So in God's covenant, it's not just hey, if you do this, I will do this, right? It's also, if you don't do this, I will do this.
Right.
And so God looks and says, hey, even when you reach the point where you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, I'll fulfill my end of that covenant, which is I'm gonna try to get your attention. I'm gonna allow some bad things to happen to you, right? But if in that you remember me, then I will renew my covenant with you.
Yeah. I think like we can go through this and we can explain that and people like can get that and say, okay, well, maybe I can't do this with God's promises and maybe I need to be obedient to actually get God's promises. But I think the thing that clicked for me is is the part that I think is like applicable for the whole seeds concept of like basic real life like Christianity, where it's not just about us claiming God's promises, but it's that we don't act this way with people.
Right. Right.
Like, we could say, okay, I get that's a relationship with God, but we're supposed to love God and love people essentially the same way.
Yeah.
So, like, I just see people doing this whole like broken half covenant, half commitment, half promise thing with each other all the time. And we don't think this applies, but I think this, like, you have to hold up your end, I have to hold up my end, completely applies to an us relationship as well as just us and God.
Yeah, you know, one of the simple basics of Christianity is discipline. Not simple in nature, but it's the fact that God says, listen, if you don't do what I've asked you to do, right? If you get off track, right? I'm going to discipline you some way, shape, or form to get you back on track. Again, and God, He wants us to be holy. He wants us to be like Him. So I love what you're saying here, because in God's covenant, it's always if-then. We've talked about that on many different shows, right? It's an if-then thing, but it also includes, like I said, both sides of it, right? So there's the positive side.
Right.
If you love me, I will love you back the way you want me to love you. But God also says, if you don't love me, if you choose not to love me, right? Well, then here's what this is going to kick in. It's going to kick in my discipline. I think that in human relationships, we've gotten so far away from that side.
Right.
Right? We're just focused on the first part of that, which is if you love me somewhere. If you love me, this is what's going to happen.
Right.
But there is a second side to that, which is what happens when you decide not to keep your part of the commitments.
Right. And like that's where I think we need to translate this for people. Like, we used a couple good examples. Like in Sunday school yesterday, we were talking about, you know, a marriage covenant, and we were talking about like a work employee agreement, right? Because both ways they're like technical, like legal agreements. They're promises made. There's things written, there's things said, there's things promised. In marriage, it's vowed to God as well. Like, so I think they're good, like, real life examples where we don't do that. We go into work and we don't do the job that we legally said we were going to do, but then we expect the employer to keep us employed. And if they don't, then we're offended.
Yep.
And the same thing with a spouse. Like, we'll say, hey, you know what? Like, I don't really feel like acting like your wife, but you need to be my husband.
Yep.
And I break that, but then if you say, well, it's broken, then you're the bad guy. And I'm like, I don't really, that's how God functions. Like, from what this says, God says you break your end of the deal's broken. And if you decide to, you know, re-enter the deal, then the deal's on. But it's not like He just keeps pouring out all the blessings here and they do whatever they want.
You know, it's the concept of free will, isn't it? The fact that God promises He's not going to force us to do things. So He wants us to want to do it, right? And I think sometimes, whether it's the workplace or in the marriage covenant or in friendship covenants or whatever it is, we want to force, right, the employee to do what we want him to do or her to do. We want to force the spouse to do it. And God says that's not what covenant relationships are about. They're about integrity and honor and respect and your word and all of those kind of things. And so I want to keep it, right? But we live in a world that says, I want to be able to do whatever I want without any consequences. And that's what you're talking about. You're talking about, like, what happens when people decide that they don't want to keep their end of the bargain, but they're going to insist that other people keep their end of the bargain.
Yeah. Well, in my eyes, from what I see here, and you guys can read the whole chapter and decide yourself, but to me it looks like God says there is no bargain. Like, if here's my offer, like when He offers you to be the bride, right? He says, here's what I'm offering you.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm offering you, like, eternity with me. I'm offering you all these things, all these promises you can claim, but you have to choose to be the bride. Now, that's not just saying, like we talked about, guys, it's not a magical prayer. It's you actually making Him the Lord of your life, and that equals you loving Him back, which is the whole James thing. Like, you being a doer of the word and loving him back. So it's not just, accept the promise, accept the offer. You have to then do your end of the offer. And he says here, if you don't do your end, then I'm not giving you the blessing that I promised you. I'll remember your promise if you come back to the original offer.
Yeah, well, we tend to think that grace and mercy, right, is all about God keeping his end no matter what we do.
Right.
But it's not. The grace and the mercy is exactly what you just said. It's if we remember and we come back. Right. That's when the grace and mercy kicks in.
Yeah.
Right? The grace and mercy isn't, I can do whatever I want once I say the magical prayer and God just has to put up with me. The grace and the mercy is like, it's the prodigal son in the pig pen, longing to fill your stomach with the pods of the pig, and you remember, right? And you go back.
Yeah. All right, well, we could talk about this forever, and this is not a date night video where we will talk about it forever. So I want to, next week, guys, come back, because I want to talk about this a little more in the aspect of what this means and how this works with forgiveness. Because I think we confuse and we smush and we think things. So just to wrap it up, guys, I encourage you strongly to go read Leviticus 26. Even though you've probably never read Leviticus, it's one of those books where people are like, I'm going to skip all. There's some really good stuff in there. You got to read it all. You just got to read it all. Even if you skim through tabernacle measurements and all that stuff. But read it, read 26, and just pray about it and ask God to speak to you and see what you get from it. And really just think about this whole promises thing. And it's just, God, I keep saying God wants you to love him back. You have to prove that you love him. You can't just say I love you and then turn your face. And we can't do that to people either, in work, in marriage, in anything else. You got to hold up your end of the bargain if you expect there to be an actual commitment. It's a two-person thing. One person can't back out, and God makes that pretty clear. So we hope that you have some new insight and that you got something out of this. And we hope to see you next week so we can talk a little bit more and add in how this works with forgiveness. Have a good week, seedlings.